Something has changed around Alex Eala, and the strangest part is that it has almost nothing to do with a ranking, a trophy, or even a tennis match. Because somewhere between one tournament and the next, thousands of people stopped treating her like a young player they were simply watching, and started treating her like someone they had personally chosen to believe in, to the point that they are now crossing oceans, filling stadiums, staying past midnight after losses, and turning exhibitions into events that feel bigger than actual championship matches. Think about how strange that is, because these people are not being promised a trophy. They are not guaranteed a victory, and sometimes they are not even guaranteed that Alex will play for very long. Yet they keep showing up anyway, carrying flags, chanting her name, spending money on flights and tickets, and creating an atmosphere so overwhelming that experienced professionals are openly admitting they are no longer the biggest name on the court. And that is where this story gets interesting. Because Alex Eala did not simply become more famous over the last year. Something much harder to explain happened. She became emotionally important to people who had never met her. And once that happens in sports, the rules change completely. Because a normal fan base celebrates your victories. But this crowd has already shown that it is willing to stay through your losses, follow you from city to city, and turn up before the biggest moments even begin. So how does a 21-year-old player go from fighting for wild cards and trying to earn her place in the sport to becoming the person an entire stadium seems to revolve around? And more importantly, what happens when the support that built your confidence becomes the same pressure you now have to carry onto the court? Because the crowds are getting bigger, the expectations are getting heavier, and Alex is walking directly into the brightest stage of them all, New York. And this time, nobody is wondering whether people will show up for her. They already have. Just 12 months ago, Alex Eala was still a player most people outside tennis could barely identify, doing the invisible work every rising athlete has to endure, chasing wild cards, chasing rankings, chasing opportunities, and trying to force her way into rooms that seemed determined to remain closed. And if you had told that version of Alex that thousands of people would soon spend their own money to cross oceans simply to watch her step onto a tennis court, the idea would have sounded completely absurd. One of the first places where the change became impossible to miss was Toronto, where what should have been another routine tournament appearance suddenly turned into something nobody had planned for, because the stands began filling with flags that had nothing to do with Canada, chants that had nothing to do with the home crowd, and colors that told you exactly where the emotional center of the stadium actually was. More than 12,000 people showed up, but the attendance was only part of the story, because tennis crowds are normally built around silence during rallies and controlled emotion. Yet around Alex, that unwritten rule started disappearing. The silence cracked. The noise became louder and more personal, and suddenly, the atmosphere sounded less like a tennis tournament and more like a football match. Alex noticed it. She felt it. But Toronto was not the peak. Toronto was the warning shot. Because there is a massive difference between people showing up to support an underdog and people showing up because they genuinely expect that underdog to win, and once Alex started giving them reasons to believe, the entire dynamic changed. Washington provided the turning point. This was not simply a nice run or a respectable finish. It was a title, her first, earned against elite competition. And suddenly the question surrounding her changed. Because before Washington, the conversation was whether she belonged and whether she could compete against bigger names. But afterward, the question became much heavier. How far can this actually go? For the players who suddenly found themselves standing across the net from Alex, another question started appearing. What does it feel like to walk onto a court when thousands of strangers have already decided that you are the villain in someone else's story? One experienced opponent admitted that the noise was not simply loud, it was disorienting, because every major point triggered another explosion and neutral ground started disappearing, while even players being overwhelmed by the atmosphere acknowledged that there was something magnetic about it, something almost enjoyable about being caught inside a storm that you could not control but could not help respecting. The fans were no longer simply watching, they were affecting the match. And then Cincinnati arrived. This was supposed to be the moment when the excitement finally met reality, because a rising player can create enormous attention during a winning run, but the real test is what happens when the winning stops. Third round, a brutal marathon, momentum swinging back and forth until the night swallowed the clock. And then, Alex lost. Normally, that should have been the end of the evening, because people check their phones, grab their jackets, and leave once the result is decided. But that is not what happened. They stayed. Past midnight. Flags were still raised, people were still watching, and every time Alex fought for another point in a match she could no longer win. The crowd reacted as if sheer noise could somehow change the outcome. It could not. They knew it could not. And they stayed anyway. That is the moment this story became something different, because a crowd that only appears when you win is a crowd of fair-weather supporters, but a crowd that remains when you lose. Deep into the night, watching a battle it already knows is lost, is no longer simply following results. That is attachment. That is loyalty. They were not tracking the score anymore. They were tracking her. And once that kind of relationship forms between an athlete and a crowd, the next time the lights get brighter, the crowd does not disappear. It gets bigger. Which brings us to New York, Flushing Meadows, the loudest and most unforgiving stage in tennis, where the phenomenon did not even wait for the main draw, because an exhibition involving Alex was already drawing a crowd that most players would be thrilled to see for a championship final. 23,000 seats. Not mostly full. Not impressively full. Full, the kind of atmosphere you expect when something important is being decided, not when players are supposed to be warming up. And once again, the gravity of the entire building seemed to bend toward a 21-year-old who, only a year earlier, had been fighting simply to get into these rooms. But this time there was something personal underneath the spectacle, because her opponent had beaten her twice before. Twice. Not just a statistic, but a debt. Unfinished business sitting somewhere in the back of her mind every time she bounced the ball before serving. So, this was not simply an exhibition anymore. It was a chance to erase a ghost. And in front of a sold-out crowd holding its breath, Alex did exactly that. She won. Just like that, 2 painful losses stopped being the story and became history. Buried underneath a deafening roar that sounded nothing like the reaction to a low-stakes exhibition, because the crowd reacted as though something had finally been settled, something personal, something they had been carrying alongside her. And suddenly the pattern was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Toronto revealed it. Washington amplified it. Cincinnati tested it. New York confirmed it. But then came the question almost nobody had thought to ask. What does it actually feel like to stand a few feet away from someone when an entire stadium seems to belong to them and not to you? Because Alex was not alone on that court. She had a doubles partner, an established and decorated professional, a former Grand Slam semifinalist and Olympic medalist, someone whose resume should have made him the obvious name people were watching, yet instead he essentially admitted that he was not generating the electricity, he was standing inside someone else's storm and trying to keep up with it. Think about how upside down that is, because tennis runs on rankings, resumes, ego, and accomplishments stacked like armor. Yet here was a decorated veteran conceding the atmosphere to a 21-year-old partner because he had already experienced what happened in Canada and knew New York would be bigger. That admission proves the phenomenon has stopped being contained to Alex alone. Opponents feel it, partners feel it, broadcasters feel it, and somewhere underneath all of it, Alex feels it too. Because there is a word for what develops underneath fame like this. Weight. Not ordinary pre-match nerves, but the pressure of knowing thousands of people have wrapped their pride, their identity, and their emotions around whether you win or lose a tennis match that you never asked them to care about this much. Picture walking onto the court and seeing a wall of your country's colors staring back at you, hearing your own name before the first ball is struck, knowing that one clean winner will trigger an explosion while one unforced error will disappoint thousands of people who desperately want you to succeed. That is not ordinary pressure. That is love transformed into expectation. And here's the contradiction that makes this story impossible to simplify. Because Alex can experience that same crowd as heavy, chaotic, surreal, and overwhelming while somehow describing the entire thing as fun at the same time. Because both things can exist together, and the same crowd noise that lifts her into moments she might not reach alone could eventually become the weight that threatens to crush her if a loss comes at the wrong time, on the wrong stage, in front of the wrong amount of hope. Which means the real story is no longer simply about the fans. It is about whether Alex can control the very thing she helped create. Because eventually support becomes expectation, expectation becomes pressure, and pressure becomes its own opponent. One that does not appear on a bracket and cannot be scouted on film. Beating Alex is no longer simply about beating her forehand or return. It is about surviving the environment she carries onto the court, an environment that can affect opponents before the match even tightens. What happens when an opponent hits a perfect winner and the entire building suddenly goes silent? What happens when Alex wins one brutal point and thousands of people explode at once? What happens in the final moments of a close match when one player desperately needs stillness and the other has an entire stadium supplying oxygen? At that point, you are not simply playing Alex. You are playing inside an atmosphere that belongs to her. And that is why this phenomenon cannot be measured like an ordinary statistic. Because rankings can be measured, titles can be counted, attendance can be recorded, but there is no number that can capture the psychological impact of walking into a stadium and instantly realizing that the emotional momentum already belongs to the person standing across the net. The results are rising alongside the crowds, with a career-high ranking inside the top 20, 7 wins over top 10 opponents in a single season, a deep Wimbledon run, and a maiden tour-level title earned against elite competition. The fans are not cheering for a promise anymore. They are reacting to proof. And now all of that momentum is heading straight into the biggest stage tennis has to offer. The US Open, filled with former world number ones, Grand Slam champions, established stars and home crowd favorites who should logically be absorbing the spotlight themselves. Yet again and again, the spotlight keeps sliding toward a 21-year-old who was fighting for wild cards only a year ago. That is the transformation people miss if they only watch the scoreboard. It is not simply that she got better. It is that people started expecting her to be better, publicly and loudly, with thousands of dollars in plane tickets already spent on that expectation. And expectation is one of the most dangerous forces in sports, because support during a winning streak is effortless, but the real test comes when things stop going according to plan. When the first set slips away, when an opponent finally solves the puzzle, when the score tightens and the crowd's energy shifts from celebration to held breath. That is the moment that will define what comes next, because it forces a question no ranking, seed or highlight reel can answer in advance. Can Alex carry the crowd without allowing the crowd to carry her instead? Can she use thousands of strangers as fuel without becoming trapped underneath what they expect her to deliver? Can she remain the same relentless player who once had to fight just to earn a seat at this table, now that thousands of people are demanding something extraordinary from her? Nobody knows. Not her coaches. Not her rivals. Not the analysts watching every match. And that uncertainty is exactly why this story refuses to sit still. Because this is happening in real time, unfinished and unresolved. With the crowds getting bigger, the expectations getting heavier, the stages getting brighter, and every tournament carrying the possibility of rewriting the entire story overnight. Maybe she wins again, and the phenomenon grows beyond anything tennis has seen from a player this young in years. Maybe she loses, and the crowd stays anyway, proving Cincinnati was not a fluke, but a preview. Maybe the pressure becomes too heavy. Or maybe she discovers exactly how to turn all of that pressure into controlled power. Nobody can predict what comes next. But look at what has already happened. 3,000 people crossing an ocean for a session that was not even a real match. Stadiums thousands of miles from home turning into something close to home games. A brutal loss keeping a crowd in its seats past midnight. An exhibition generating the noise of a championship final. A decorated veteran admitting he was riding a wave that belonged to someone else. And opponents feeling the atmosphere shift before the first serve was even struck. This has stopped being a simple fan base. A fan base watches. This follows. A fan base cheers when you win. This stays when you lose. A fan base buys a ticket. This crosses oceans. And maybe that is the real reason it keeps getting bigger. Because underneath all of it, this was never only about tennis. It is about what happens when enough people watch a young athlete fight her way into rooms nobody was sure she would ever enter, and then quietly decide they are walking through those doors right beside her, whatever it costs, however far it takes them. So as the tournament gets deeper, the opponents get tougher, the stadiums get louder, and the margin for error becomes almost non-existent. The real question is no longer whether Alex has support, because that question has already been answered. The flags are there, the chants are there, the belief is already sitting in the stands waiting, and the only question left is what she chooses to do with all of it. Because eventually the noise fades, the stadium lights dim, the flags come down, and she is left standing alone at the baseline, with one ball in her hand and one impossible question in her head. Can she still be exactly who she has always been now that everyone around her needs her to be something more? That is the real test waiting in the next chapter. Because she has already proven she can build a crowd, she has already proven she can make people believe. And now she has to prove she can carry that belief without allowing it to become the very thing that breaks her stride. A year ago, almost nobody outside the sport was asking how far this could go. Now, people are crossing oceans just to watch her take the next step. And if the last 12 months have proven anything at all, it is this. Every time the world assumes it has finally seen the ceiling of this phenomenon, Alex finds a way to make everyone look up again. Bigger crowds, heavier expectations, brighter lights, and somehow, impossibly, the story just keeps getting louder. Which means the real question was never whether this was real. Everyone inside those stadiums already knows it is. The only question left is how far it can actually go. Because if the last year is any preview, betting against Alex Eala and against the thousands of people who have already decided they are not going anywhere might be the single riskiest bet left in the entire tournament.